Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are working on lab lesson number 11, which is about the spinal cords, the spinal nerves and their plexuses. And this is actually our last week and muscles and bones and muscle movement. Here's a reminder that we probably don't want to get, but we need to get. Anyone in class today happen to remember when the lab final exam is? Do we know how far away it is? Have we started looking at that? Well, that's the lecture exam. Oh, no, I believe, I might be wrong. Uh-oh, Dr. Allis doesn't even know. I believe we have until the beginning of May, but I might be wrong. Kaylin's like, I don't know, when you say exam. Yeah, so I should really check to make sure too. If I am doing my math correctly, it ends 3 weeks from yesterday. So Kaylin's saying the 4th. Yeah, so I believe the lab exam is open May 3rd and 4th are the days on that exam. So we have a little bit longer. You all are over-prepared, right? What we are doing the week of the 27th is we are having a review week. So giving you a chance to go back and review all of the different topics that are on the exam. That's that week of the 27th. The week after that is when we'll actually take the exam. So we've got this week's lesson, that's new stuff. We've got next week's lesson, which is new stuff about the special senses. Then we've got our review week. Then we've got the exam for lab. So we have a little bit longer than my friends in class today thought, but it is still coming up fast. And remember that there are lots of different review assignments for you to be working on. Please don't save them all until Sunday of the week of the exam, because I promise you it will take you all day and you will hate anatomy even more. So start working on some of those earlier review assignments because we've covered that material. Kira's mentioning the checklist. I need to check the assignment checklist. It may be correct. That may be accurate. I will do some looking and I will let you all know tomorrow. Apologies on that if I got those mixed up on you. All right, to talk about the spinal cord and what's going on in the back, we worked through a series of slides in groups today to use our directional terms, use some of our other terms that we worked through to figure out the locations of various things. So first thing for us to know about the spinal cord, and we'll talk about gray matter and white matter in lecture tomorrow a little bit more. First thing is for us to know is that the gray matter of the spinal cord is arranged in these things we call horns. So you'll see this on the homework assignment, you'll see this in the lab packet. We've got gray matter horns. Those horns have different first names. They all share the last name that tells us they're gray matter. Their first name is a directional term to help us know where they're found. Now, on this picture that we're going to label in many different ways, we are looking at the spinal cord in the middle of one vertebra. For my friends here in class, can you tell me which page do you have the model that looks the most like this picture? What page is that model on? Okay, Chris is saying page 4. Yeah, so we just have one model that shows the vertebrae, or excuse me, the spinal cord inside a vertebra. Let me give you some hints when you're looking at the spinal cord inside vertebra to tell you front versus back. Because when we work on the homework assignment and when we work on the exam, we're not going to tell you those things. Perhaps the easiest way back is because of this structure here. This structure right here is a part of a vertebrae. All vertebrae have this, called a spinous process. Spinous process. When you touch your spine, when you're feeling your vertebrae, this is the part that you feel. It sticks out column. So the spinous process is always on the back side of the body and the back side of a vertebra. This particular spinous process has a special name This particular one is called a bifid spinous process. It gets this name because it actually has two branches that we see back here. So the bifid spinous process, this tells us that we are seeing a particular kind of vertebrae. The kind of vertebrae with a bifid spinous process is called a cervical vertebra. A cervical vertebra. So cervical vertebrae are the only ones that have a bifid spinous process. Can you remind me in the chat, when we talk about a cervical vertebra, where in the body is that found? What part of the spine is the cervical part of the spine? Cervical region. Yeah, exactly. We're talking about the neck. Absolutely. The vertebrae in your neck, first way you'll identify them, they have this part here called the bifid spinous process, where the part that sticks out has two branches on it. That's because there's so many different muscles that attach in different ways up in your neck, so we actually branch in two directions, a bifid spinous process. The other thing that we see that lets us know that this is a cervical vertebrae in your neck are these two little holes that you see right here. These two little holes that we see right here, get my label out here, these are called my transverse foramen. Transverse foramen. I only have transverse foramen when I'm talking about a cervical vertebrae, because these little holes that I see on both sides of my vertebrae here, these are the places where the blood vessels going to and from the brain will travel through. So we have some blood vessels that are protected inside the case of our vertebrae to make sure they make it up to the brain undamaged. This is their little special hole right here called the transverse foramen. So these transverse foramina, these holes, these are always on the front side of the vertebrae, and my bifid spinous process is always on the back side of the vertebrae when we are a cervical vertebra. Later in class today, we'll look at our thoracic and lumbar vertebrae as well. They will have spinous processes too. It'll just have one branch back there. They will not, under any circumstances, have these holes out here. So these tell us for sure that we are looking at a cervical vertebra. So on this particular model, we've got a couple of markings we see on the bones to tell us front from back. The spinous process, the easiest one, but also these transverse foramen as well. If we're looking at most of our models where they don't have a vertebrae, there's another marking that can help us tell front from back. And it's a marking that we should underline, highlight, star. We absolutely must know it. And that is this little thing right here. If we are looking at the spinal cord by itself with no bones, we've got this structure, and I think both of my groups actually talked about this together, bump thing called right here. I can see it on either side, my big bump. I guess that's a mean thing to make you type, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. So the full technical name, I'm only going to type it once, and then I'm going to abbreviate for the rest of class today, probably. The bump that we see is something called the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion. I like to abbreviate it DRG, dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion is something found on the dorsal side of the spinal cord. Dorsal was a word that we learned way back in week number 2. Dorsal was the same thing as posterior or on the back side. So if I give you a spinal cord model that doesn't have this nice vertebra around it to tell us front versus back, the very first thing you should always look for, where's the bump? The bump is always going to be on the dorsal root. It's always going to be on the back side. So Dorsal root ganglion back here, that's the other way we can tell front from back. With that in mind, we know that the back side of the model is up here and the front side's up here. We found some hints for it. When we're looking at our three horns right here, the one that I'm looking at that's closest to the back side of the body and the back side of the spinal cord, which of my three horns would I call this one right here? The one that's toward the back of the body. Only Kira is feeling brave. There we go. A couple others. We just talked about it. I promise it's not a trick question. This one here on the back side, because it's closest to the spinous process, because it's closest to the function of the ganglion, dorsal horn. Here on the outside of my spinal cord, the next one that I see here protruding out, this one is my lateral horn. My lateral horn, because it's more toward the outside. It's away from the midline. And then in the very front, toward the anterior of the spinal cord, we have what's called the ventral horn, the ventral horn. So every time you sit down with a spinal cord model, because there's a whole bunch of those spinal cord models, first thing I want you to find always, the dorsal root ganglion, because that tells you where the front is versus where the back is. Once I know where the front is versus where the back is, it's just as easy as saying dorsal horn in the back, ventral horn in the front, lateral horn, the one that sticks out on the side. First thing we can use our critical thinking for, or use the meaning of our words for, labeling the gray matter of the spinal cord. Next thing we can use our labeling skills or our critical thinking for is labeling things that we call the roots and the rami. These are both structures that relate to spinal nerves. And today we're going to look at some different spinal nerves that we find in the body. So the spinal cord lives inside the vertebral column and it can't get out. What can get out of the spinal cord are spinal nerves. So spinal nerves leave the spinal cord, except it's not as simple as just they leave and go places. Spinal nerves split. They can't stick together too long. That's just too much pressure. So they form these splits or these branches that are called a ramus. Again, when we're looking at our model here that has the vertebrae around it, remember that my spinous process is always on the dorsal side of the body. So my little branch that sneaks in the dorsal direction, this one's going to be what I call the dorsal ramus. The dorsal ramus. This one's very small. All it's doing is going to the skin and the muscles of the back side of your body. To what we see the job of the ventral ramus being. The ventral ramus is much more involved in taking care of things like your limbs, so moving your arms and legs, giving some information to some of those organs that we see in your thoracic cavity, for example. So the ventral ramus, a lot bigger, does a lot more, takes care of a lot more of the body. The dorsal ramus just goes to the back side of the body. Attached directly to the spinal cord itself are things that we call the roots. So the roots are right here next to the spinal cord. The back one, the one with the dorsal root ganglion, that's the one that we call the dorsal root. In fact, that's how the dorsal root ganglion got its name. The ganglion, let me write that really fast. That ganglion word that you see in the name of the dorsal root ganglion, it just means a group of cells, essentially. The dorsal root ganglion is where I see lots of cell bodies of my neurons chilling out when they're on their way into the spinal cord. So the neurons that travel here in the dorsal root, all their cell bodies live out here, and they send their axons into the spinal cord. The dorsal root, that's the location of the dorsal root ganglion, the bump that we see there. The ventral root is on the front side, on the ventral side or the anterior side. The ventral root is actually going to see information leaving the spinal cord. So the dorsal root is where sensory information comes into the spinal cord. The ventral root is where motor information leaves. With motor information, we don't have a ganglion. We don't have a bump where there's a bunch of cells living inside of it. All we have is axons that are leaving the spinal cord. So the ventral root is always going to be skinny. The dorsal root is always going to have a bump on it. I liked, by the way, how one of my groups was talking about if we go from the perspective of the spinal cord, we would say that the first thing that the spinal cord bumps into, or the first thing attached to it, are the roots. Then we go into the ganglion, and after the ganglion, we have the rami. This word ramus, by the way, literally means branch, like branch on a tree. So previous groups of students, we've talked about how a tree needs to have roots before it can have branches. So that'd be another way that you could think about it. So the roots are attached to my source here, the water source or whatever you want to call it, the spinal cord. We've got the roots attached to it, and then the branches and go all over the place. Roots and rami, that's what we covered on this slide. When we go to internal anatomy of the spinal cord, just 3 structures for us to label here on the inside, because we already talked about those horns. The first structure for us to label is this thing right here. This hole, it's literally an open space. There's cerebrospinal fluid inside of here. What's this space here in the middle of the spinal cord called? My little central hole here. Yeah, exactly. This hole in the middle of the spinal cord is a place called the central canal. The central canal. So like I mentioned, this is a place that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. If you remember from last week when we talked about how the 4th ventricle, the last fluid-filled space in the brain, can actually send fluid into the spinal cord, here's where that fluid that came from the spinal cord goes, into the central canal. So the central canal here in the very middle of the spinal cord. Then we've got structures again where that terminology dorsal and ventral comes up. So when I am here on the front side of my spinal cord, is that going to be the dorsal or the ventral one that I have here, since I'm on the front side of the spinal cord? Is front dorsal or ventral? Yeah, exactly. Front is ventral. So we've got the ventral median fissure. A fissure is an indentation, just like it was in a bone. It's the same thing here. It's the ventral one, so it's on the front side, versus my other side, where we have the dorsal median sulcus. Again, a sulcus is an indentation. My dorsal median sulcus here on the back side as well. Before we move outside the spinal cord, any questions? The horns, about the roots and rami, about these structures? Okay, well, we're all good, so let's do our last group work one then. The last thing we looked at were the meninges, or the connective tissue layers that we find around the spinal cord. Literally, these connective tissue layers around the spinal cord are attached to the layers that we find around the brain, and they have the exact same names. So if you remember from studying the layers around the brain, they're found in the exact same places when we're looking at those layers around the spinal cord. So for example, I am looking at the layer that's directly touching the spinal cord right here. That's this first arrow. The deepest layer is the one that's touching the spinal cord. Which of these three was the one that actually touched the spinal cord? And it was the same one that actually touched the brain. Yeah, exactly. The pia mater is the name of the connective tissue layer that touches the spinal cord. It's the exact same layer. Literally, it's attached to the part that touches the brain, the pia mater, the deepest one. Then we go up to the intermediate layer, or the one that's just on the outside, the one that's in the middle, I guess we would say. Hey, look, I can see little tiny spider webs. Who was it that made the spider webs? Who's that spider web layer? Which one's that? Yep, the one that makes the spider webs, or looks like spider webs, to be fair, is the arachnoid mater, with all the little collagen proteins that help it to stay close to the pia mater. I know I heard at least one of my groups talking about this. Remember that underneath the arachnoid mater is where I find cerebrospinal fluid. So we will talk about this in the next unit in lecture. When someone gets a spinal tap, or when we're doing puncture, where we're trying to go is into the subarachnoid space, the space underneath the arachnoid mater, because the spinal cord is floating around in cerebrospinal fluid. So there's cerebrospinal fluid that I find in between the pia mater that touches the spinal cord and the arachnoid mater that I find just outside of it. And then notice on my picture here, I've got this really thick dura mater layer here on the outside. The dura mater was the most superficial layer of the meninges. It was also the thickest layer of the meninges. So you can see it very thick right here. Can you all tell from the picture? What is this that I find on the outside of the dura mater? Any idea what this is that we see out here? Yeah, exactly. So this stuff out here is adipose tissue. Think about this adipose tissue kind of like bubble wrap. So your spinal cord is really important, right? We want to make sure that, like, when you're living your life, when your spinal cord is in transit, when you walk places, we don't want it to get damaged. We don't want it to bump into your hard bone. So we actually have adipose tissue that goes between the bony tissue and all of these meninges, the connective tissue layers that are around the spinal cord. And then the spinal cord itself is suspended in that fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. So for the brain and the spinal cord, we try to have extra layers of protection, especially when we're in the spinal cord, this layer that we see here with that adipose tissue. Overall, how do we feel about the things that we've labeled so far? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle. I don't know if we actually have a thumbs in the middle. Okay, generally feeling good. Let me peek. So I'm not going to take the time to label all three of the spinal cord models that you see at the beginning of your lab packet. I will take an informal vote. Which one do we want to review together? Here's my top. This one or this one? So here's number 2. Here's number 1. Any votes? Kira doesn't care. Alapina likes number 1. He does too. We're gonna go back and forth. Okay, Okay, well, I saw your question, Temiteo. Let me answer that question really fast. And then we will briefly review maybe both of them really fast. The vertebral foramen, here, let's pull it up on the model. The vertebral foramen, here's the model, I was told from page 4, that shows everything we just labeled. The vertebral foramen is this entire opening space inside a vertebrae. And it's actually a bone marking that you will be labeling as well when you're labeling the bone markings of the vertebrae. Every single vertebrae has a vertebral foramen. Let me see if I have a good top-down slide of my vertebrae here. Yeah, this one's pretty good. This shows me the 2 types of vertebrae we didn't look at yet, so they're completely new to us. This big part that you see on all of your vertebrae is called the body of the vertebrae. And then the really big hole that all of them have is the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is the place where the spinal cord is found. So notice that, yeah, so special cases here. Here's a normal cervical vertebrae. There's my vertebral foramen. When I talk about my first 2 cervical vertebrae, they actually look different than the other ones, and they have their own names. So make sure we know that the very first vertebra in your vertebral column is called the atlas. This is the one where your skull actually sits on top of. So you can see these places here are superior articular facets where your skull literally sits on top of your vertebrae. This is our first vertebrae. You've got a big, why am I blanking here? A big vertebral foramen. I'm so sorry. Remember how I told y'all who were here early that I was sitting in the dark room with the baby before? Yeah, that's catching up with me. So big vertebral foramen right here. You can see the small transverse foramen here on the sides. First cervical vertebrae, the atlas, we do not see that thing we talked about before called the spinous process. So the spinous process is missing from the atlas. If you see this funky shaped bone, that is cervical vertebra number 1, the first cervical vertebra. It has no process. When we see the second cervical vertebra, vertebra number 2, this one is called the axis. So the axis, the way you're going to recognize this one is because of a part that sticks up on it. This part here is called the dens, or sometimes you'll hear it called the odontoid process. This vertebra, the axis, is the one that allows you to twist your head left and right. So this dens is the structure that literally allows you to turn left and right, to shake your head no, if you will. The atlas is the one that allows you to nod your head yes. So back and forth with the atlas, turning it side to side with the axis. The axis has this thing called the dens. But it also has the vertebral foramen. It also has the transverse foramen. And it also has that bifid spinous process. Because again, this is the one that looks most like what we had on that model with our bifid spinous process, with that vertebral foramen, and then those 2 transverse foramen that we see here. While we're talking vertebrae, let me just mention, we've talked about all the ways to identify a cervical vertebrae. When you look at a thoracic vertebrae from the side kind of look like a giraffe. So here's the giraffe face. Here's those weird things that stick out from their heads, right? Here's the little ears. So when you see a giraffe thoracic vertebra, when you look at it from the side and it looks like a moose, like we see here, so the big antlers on my big moose face, that's a lumbar vertebra. So from the side, see what animal we see. From the top, you've got the largest vertebral body on a lumbar vertebrae because all of the weight that's in your back gets focused here to the bottom of your spine. So the lumbar vertebrae have really large bodies. The bodies aren't quite as large when we're talking about the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae also have a space for them to interact with the ribs. So notice how we've got these extra bumps right here. these are places where those thoracic vertebrae would interact with the ribs to help you form the rib cage. So giraffe versus moose, when we talk about those cervical vertebrae, look for the two branches in their spinous process and look for those transverse foramen, those little holes out there. Let me go to, so I'm actually gonna, I'm gonna actually do this model. I know that we didn't have as many votes for it. I think that might be because it's uglier. I'm gonna do the uglier one on purpose because that first one is, I feel like, a lot clearer and it should be easier for us to label. So I actually want to do this bad one here. Actually, the other one is the worst, but it's too bad for me. I don't want to do that one. First thing that I always want you to look for when we sit down with the spinal cord model, the first thing we're always looking for, this right here, dorsal ganglion, dorsal root ganglion. If you were to describe to me in as simple words as possible what this looks like, what does the dorsal root ganglion look like? What's the easiest possible way that you could describe it? Yeah, like it looks like a bump, something that's kind of bulbous, right? Maybe something that's round, or it's kind of extended, right? The dorsal root ganglion. When I'm looking at my model here, see this nice big bump. My dorsal root ganglia, I'm going to abbreviate them. Dorsal root ganglion, every single time. I don't care if I don't ask you for it, although to be frank, I probably will ask you, like I'm 99% sure I will ask you on the exam about this, because this is what we use to find the backside. So my dorsal root ganglion is my bump in this whole thing that is the dorsal root. Here's my whole dorsal root. On this model, we do ask you to label the spinal nerves. Let me put a little box. This place where my dorsal root and my ventral root, so I've got two of them here. The place where the dorsal root and the ventral root have fused, that's the spinal nerve. So my ventral roots are these guys here. I guess I should put some labels. Here's that ventral root, and then we've got our dorsal roots along the backside, dorsal root. Once we know front vertebra, that helps us out with identifying our horns. The lateral horn is always going to be on the side. So if you ever see an arrow that is pointing toward the side of the gray matter, sometimes that lateral root is going to look really pronounced. Sometimes it's going to be kind of hard to see, but the lateral horn. So my lateral horn is here on the side. It's also right here on the side. And then when we are labeling dorsal versus ventral, again, that's what the ganglion helps me out with. So my two on the back side are my dorsal gray horns, and my two on the front side are the ventral gray horns. The ventral gray horns. If you see anything that's pointing to somewhere on the spinal cord that is white matter, I'm asking you about things that are called funiculi. Funiculi. Now, when we talk about this structure, we're not going to call them funiculi. We're going to use an easier word for them. We're actually going to call them tracts. So yeah, I mean, it's a fun word, literally a fun word, right? But funiculi, if you like it, or if you don't like it, in lecture, I'm going to call them tracts. But all of the white matter in the spinal cord is essentially arranged in groups. So I've got little groups of neurons that are all traveling the same direction right here. That's one funiculus. And I've got little groups of neurons that are all traveling the same direction right here. Everywhere in the white matter, we've essentially got these super highways, groups of neurons that are all traveling the same direction. So anywhere I'm pointing on this model that's in the white matter, you would call that the white matter funiculi. My groups of neurons that are all traveling really fast, up or down. That's our funiculi. And we labeled these things before. Remember, my ventral median fissure is the indentation on the front side. My dorsal median sulcus is the indentation on the back side. And then you've got that central canal in the very middle, the hole for the cerebrospinal fluid. Anything on this model or on those other two that we wanted to make sure to clarify before we moved on? Okay, well, let's move to this. I believe you have a spot in your book to draw a sketch of the spinal cord slide. Is that correct? Do we still ask you to do that? Okay. So this is a really awesome picture of what that slide would have looked like if we were in class together. So this is one of those slides that you could actually just hold the slide up to the light in the classroom and you could actually see this. So when you're looking at the spinal cord, it can be a little bit challenging. Not all of our slides would have our big dorsal root ganglion on them that we can see here. But a hint for you when we're trying to figure out dorsal and ventral horns, the dorsal horn a lot of times will even actually go back and touch the very back of the spinal cord. The ventral horn doesn't typically make it all the way to the edge of the spinal cord. So we have other pictures, for example. See how on this one right here, my dorsal horn is all the way attached to the back of the spinal cord. We can tell where the dorsal one is because it's back there. Same thing with this one here. The dorsal horn went all the way to the back of the spinal cord, where the ventral horn doesn't make it to the edge. So just a study tip for you, if you can't find the ganglion when you're looking at images of a slide, if you can't find the ganglion, knowing that the dorsal typically reaches the edge of the spinal cord and the ventral horn doesn't, that might help you out. Yeah, it does kind of look like a butterfly, doesn't it? I love looking at this slide with my naked eyes, like when we're in the classroom and just look at it, because it's just so pretty, because you can really see the difference between the gray matter and the white matter. It looks very different when we're looking at the slides. All right. We labeled a lot of the stuff on this model. Were there any other things, because we did the group work kind of covering this. Was there any other questions you all had about this model before we go to that big spinal cord model? Expansion's good, Edith's good. I'll reiterate, we'd mentioned it before, the vertebral foramen is kind of this whole area here, where almost everything we labeled, that whole area, that's the vertebral foramen. All right, well, let's go big picture then. If we were in class together, the model is actually pretty much life size. So imagine seeing this really huge life size. I know in your lab packet, it's not nearly huge as that. But on the next couple of slides, I took that picture you have that you're labeling in your packet and I split it into a couple of parts so we can see things a little bit better. So we'll go through and talk about some of the things that you're labeling. I'll probably label most of them when we're looking at the big picture of the model as opposed to the little one. By the way, this is a good time for you to consider reviewing some of your cranial nerves. We asked you to label a few cranial nerves on this model, didn't we? Am I remembering correctly? I think we had to do a couple. Yeah. So when I'm looking at this model, notice up here on the brain, I can see cranial nerve number 1 Do we happen to remember the name of cranial nerve number 1? Who's number 1? Yeah, olfactory, exactly. Very first pair of cranial nerves are the olfactory nerves that we find toward the front of the brain. You can see those ones pretty good on this model. We can kind of see our crisscross that makes up cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, right here, cranial nerve number 2. The next cranial nerves, number 3, were at the very top of the pons. So this is cranial nerve number 3, the olfactory nerve. Good news, I'm not going to make you label 4 on this model. That was hard enough to see on the brain models. It would be kind of hiding somewhere back here. Same thing with 5. You can kind of see it, but not clearly. We can definitely see number 6, though. Number 6 comes off where the medulla oblongata meets the pons. So there's number 6. I believe that's, yeah, the abducens, absolutely. I believe that's the last one we asked you to label, correct? So I think it was 1, 2, 3, and 6 that we wanted you to label. Oh, and number 9, or hypoglossal. Oh, number 12. I'm getting it mixed up. Uh-oh, shame on Dr. Ollis. 11 is accessory. Yeah, so number 12. Number 12 is my one that we're seeing up here. So number 12 up in this range as well. Yeah, hypoglossal is number 12. Accessory is number 11. Accessory is actually this guy right here. Check this out. This is why, remember I told you that the accessory nerve we sometimes talk about as is it actually a cranial nerve or is it a spinal nerve? You can see some of those little branches of it right here. So here's number 11, that accessory nerve. And it goes way down with a bunch of my spinal nerves. So that's what makes it so controversial in anatomy. Here's where number 11 is. We don't ask you to label it, but for your reference, there it is. Full disclosure, I'm probably not going to ask you to label many of those cranial nerves on this model on the exam, but do make sure we know number 1. Do make sure we know number 6 and probably number 3. Those are really easy to see if you know their locations. So make sure we know 1, 3, and 6. Make sure we can find those. When we're looking at the spinal cord, remember that the spinal cord connects to we're going to start over. Okay. The spinal cord connects to a part of the brain stem called the medulla oblongata. So at the very top, where the spinal cord is connecting to the brainstem, we've got our medulla oblongata. Then we transition into the spinal cord itself. The spinal cord itself found in that vertebral foramen. When we look at the spinal cord, it has a couple of areas that are called enlargements. So the first enlargement, you can kind of see how right here, let me get my box and I'll let go. See how right here, this part of the spinal cord gets wider? We're a little bit skinnier up here. We're a little bit skinnier down below. Yeah, so this region right here, where the spinal cord is getting enlarged or getting wider in your neck region, this is called the cervical enlargement. The cervical enlargement. The cervical enlargement exists because this is the part of the spinal cord where my neurons that are going out into your arms, this is where they come from, where they start. So the cervical enlargement helps us to get the neurons we need to leave the spinal cord to go out into your arm. We'll look in a moment at an area called the lumbar enlargement. The lumbar enlargement is where the neurons that go to your legs live. So enlargements are all about taking care of those limbs. When we talk about the spinal nerves, we name them based on the area of the spinal cord that they come off of. So when I'm talking about my spinal nerves that are, I drew that maybe a little low. Let me get a different color too. When we talk about our spinal nerves that are up here kind of in the neck region, all of these we're going to call cervical nerves, cervical spinal nerves. Cervical spinal nerve are going to take care of the neck, or they're going to come together to form this structure that we see right here. This is called the brachial plexus. You can see it over here as well, the brachial plexus. Think about a plexus kind of like if you were weaving things together, like if you ever made one of those pot holders. I was in Girl Scouts way back in the day, so I was really good at making those little pot holders where you weave together the stretchy fabric. So think about this kind of like one of those pot holders that you weave stuff together. I take a bunch of neurons from different spinal nerves and I mix them together to make the nerves in the body that we're learning. That's a plexus. So this one up here that we can see the things coming off of, this is the brachial plexus. Go back to black here. This is the brachial plexus. By the way, you're going to see that labeled on your homework assignment as a bracket, most likely. You will also see a bracket up here in the neck region. Let me make it darker. If you see a bracket up here in this region, we're talking about the cervical plexus. So some of those nerves that come off of the spinal cord up high, they'll share neurons with each other to make the cervical plexus. The brachial plexus, all of these nerves share neurons with each other, make these. We do not have a thoracic plexus, so all of our thoracic spinal nerves stay separate from one another. But then we go down into the lower part of the body and we'll make the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus as well. So other than, let me just put a quick label here for my thoracic nerves. Did we miss anything in the top half of this model, or is that all my stuff in the top half? I believe we hit it all up here. Yeah, so let's go to the bottom half because, yeah, we need to find things like the cauda equina, the lumbar enlargement. Okay, so now I'm down lower in the spinal cord. So here's my big picture. We just labeled all this stuff up here. Now we're going to go down lower into the bottom half of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord itself ends here at kind of a cone-shaped structure, the spinal cord. Your spinal cord itself doesn't actually reach the end of the vertebral column. Your vertebral column ends way down here. So the spinal cord actually stops growing longer before your vertebrae are done growing longer. So the spinal cord ends up at like L1, L2, and you've got L3, 4, and 5, lots of other vertebrae, and then the sacrum is still traveling through. So this, I believe we described it as the cone-shaped end to the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris. Your spinal column is not empty. The spinal cord. Notice how we have, I'm going to put kind of a circle around them. Notice how we have all of these little nerves or neurons that come off of the end, the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord. All of these are what we call the cauda equina. Cauda equina. It literally means the horse's tail. So think about this a lot like all the hair that comes off of a horse's tail, except it's nerves. So the conus medullaris is the end of the spinal cord. Then I have all of these nerves that come off of the end of the spinal cord because I still need to send stuff down through that vertebral column, especially the stuff going down to the legs. So my cauda equina is this bundle of nerves here. Now, the conus medullaris, at the very end of the spinal cord, since it's up so high, the conus medullaris needs a little bit of help. This little blue line that I drew right here is a structure, yeah, like Alapina mentioned, this is our structure called the phylum terminal. The phylum terminal. Think about this almost like an anchor, or I don't know, maybe a seat belt for your spinal cord. See, this keeps your spinal cord attached. It goes all the way down to the coccyx down here. So it's connective tissue that goes from the conus medullaris all the way down to the end of the spinal cord. This prevents your spinal cord from flopping back and forth and from curling up in the vertebral column. It keeps it in place. Yeah, Fanshanen's mentioning that the filum terminale is a little bit challenging to find on visible body. So that would be one then to play around with. I could definitely see that being a challenging one. I would recommend try to find that conus medullaris first, and then see if we can see that connective tissue that's down next to it. So the filum terminale anchors the conus medullaris in place. The cauda equina is all of these nerves that we see here. Notice, get my pencil back, this region right here where my spinal cord got really enlarged or got a lot wider. That is my lumbar enlargement. My lumbar enlargement. Oops, got to move that. This is where the neurons that go down into the leg, where we find a bunch of them. So that's why this part of the spinal cord is enlarged. So the conus medullaris with the cauda equina next to it, the filum terminale holding everything in place. My lumbar plexus is the one that we see up higher. So making some of the big nerves that we see there, we'll label the lumbar plexus. And the sacral plexus, a little bit harder to see on here. I'm just going to kind of circle some of the nerves that make it. The sacral plexus is the one down here. The big deal with the sacral plexus is it makes that nerve that always gets angry in pregnant ladies, the sciatic nerve. Yep, so this really big, if you see a bracket around the plexus that makes this really huge nerve that you see right here, that is the sciatic nerve. So if someone has sciatica, this really huge nerve in their body is angry at them. That's why sciatica is so awful if we give some problems to this nerve here. Any other labels that we've missed on this model, or have we hit them all? Yeah, I see Elapina put a note that the plexuses are a little bit challenging to find as well in visible body. Well, let's talk a little bit about plexuses. I believe you have this sketch lesson just to show you where they all are in a very simple term. So up here at the very top in the cervical region, we've got the cervical plexus, excuse me. Then we have that brachial plexus that we saw before with some of those individual nerves that we're learning. The lumbar plexus down kind of in the lower back, and then the sacral plexus right around the sacrum. That's how it got its name. So the 4 plexuses that we find in the body. There is not a plexus here in the thoracic region, and that's because we don't have any limbs that come out of this part of our body, usually. Although my daughter recently rewatched the movie Lilo and Stitch, so Stitch has some extra arms that pop out in this region. He might have a thoracic plexus, but not you and me. Yeah, I agree, Kira. They don't make movies like that anymore. That was a good one. All right. On this model, the plexuses we've kind of hit on a little bit already. Do some quick circles. So that cervical plexus, when we're asking you about that one, we're going to have a bracket up here around those nerves in the upper neck. And then the brachial plexus, all those things that come together to go into the arm. The lumbar plexus down lower. And then the sacral plexus, lowest of them all. Let's talk about our nerves that we're labeling. Right now, these nerves that you see on the list, these are all of my arm nerves here. So when we're talking about our arm nerves, let's kind of work our way from the top to the bottom. This nerve that we see up here, does anyone happen to know this one? Have we worked on labeling nerves yet? This nerve, yep, this one is called the axillary nerve, This nerve, one of the ways I like to remember its location is this is actually the nerve that if someone gives you a shot incorrectly, so an injection into your shoulder, into your deltoid muscle, if they do it really badly, they could actually injure your axillary nerve. So the axillary nerve up here, it passes through the axillary region. Remember, that's the armpit region. So it kind of passes through the armpit region, but then circles around toward the front side. So my axillary nerve is the one that you see up here in the shoulder. Yeah, around where that deltoid muscle would be, the axillary nerve. Next one that we see down here that's kind of branching out toward the skin, this one right here, this is called the musculocutaneous nerve. Musculocutaneous. So its name tells us it does muscles and skin. The musculocutaneous nerve is that little one we can see right here. So axillary up top, musculocutaneous, and then we've got 3 different nerves that we see starting here in the arm and particularly down into the forearm. These nerves are the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, and the median nerve. Hey, the radial and the ulnar nerves, I promise their locations is not a trick question. It's using the bones that we have in these locations. So for example, this bone right here, I know you can't quite see his hand, this is his thumb side. So which bone are we looking at here on the thumb side? What bone is this that I see right here? Yeah, exactly. This is the radial, or the radius bone, excuse me. So right next to the radius bone is that radial nerve that I see right here. So my radial nerve is my lateral nerve on the radius side, the radial nerve. Then we go to the nerve that I find next to the ulna. Any guesses who this one is? What nerve is this one here? Promise it's not a trick question. Exactly. This is the ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve. Yeah, and Kira's totally right. If you bang, when, it's not an if, right? When you accidentally bang your elbow and it tingles and hurts, what's tingling and hurting is that ulnar nerve because it goes actually behind the arm. So it's running down back and then next to your ulna over there. Which leaves then for me the one in the middle of the forearm, and that is the median nerve, the one in the middle, median. Hey, so let me point something out. On the side, this hand is turned. You know how Muscle Man is so mean and not in anatomical position? This one is turned as well. This hand is doing something, we call it pronation, where if you're standing in anatomical position and you flip your palm from facing to the front, you're facing it to the back. When we're looking at it that way, now we can see a little bit better that radial nerve right here, because my thumb is on this side, and you can see that ulnar nerve right here as well. So as a heads up on this other side, my palm is flipped over. You can see those bones twisting around each other. So there's that radial nerve tracking right next to the radius, and that ulnar nerve peeking from the back side. And that median nerve right here in the middle. Those are the nerves that we see in the arm. Let's go to nerves of the leg. When we are talking about nerves of the leg, we'll start in the middle here. Up here at the very top in the middle, it is one of only 2 nerves that we're learning from the lumbar plexus. The one there in the middle is called the obturator nerve. The obturator nerve, that's there in the very middle. Here more on the outside, kind of on top of, where you can see next to my femur is the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve. Those are my 2 my 2 nerves from the lumbar plexus. Then we go into our sacral plexus nerves. So I'm going to highlight in red. Check out the, oops, check out the size of my massive sciatic nerve right here in red. And you can kind of see that massive sciatic nerve hiding there in the back. I started it on the other side. So the sciatic nerve, again, I think we described it as the largest and longest nerve in the body. That's the big one that we see there. The sciatic nerve is going to branch into multiple parts. And that's where we get our tibial nerve and our common fibular nerve. They come from branching off of the sciatic nerve. So when we track with that sciatic nerve, notice that it's, here we go, pointer back here, we see it kind of starting to split. So we've got our branch that kind of goes toward the front, and we got our branch that's staying here in the back. It actually splits into a couple of parts. For my to work on this, we'll label it on both places. Let me get different colors here. When we are talking about the nerve that goes more toward, actually let me delete that, more toward the front of the body, my blue nerve that I labeled there. Who are we chatting about with the blue nerve or the green nerve? We want to take a guess? We chimed in both nerves. Yeah, so when we're talking more toward when we're talking more toward the front side of the body, we are talking about nerve. So now y'all mixing me up too. It's time for us to consult our friend the Google. Common fibular nerve. It's going to be real here. I don't want to teach you the wrong thing. Okay, it's looking to me. Let's see if you all agree. Yeah, is it Friday yet? I wish. It is looking to me like the tibial nerve is posterior. Does that sound correct to my friends who've had a chance? Okay, Kira's thinking tibial nerve is posterior, fibular nerve is anterior. So let's put that in terms of our colored here. Okay, so for the blue, the one that is more toward the front of the body, common fibular nerve. Common fibular nerve. For my green one, that's going toward the posterior part of the body, right behind the tibia, tibial nerve. Tibial nerve. So when we're looking at this model head on, it's a little bit harder on my other leg. I'm going to try to label where the tibial nerve kind of is. I'm not, though, that is the tibial nerve there. That's as close as we come to tibial. It's much easier to see the common fibular on the front side. The word common, by the way, means that it splits into more than one part. So common fibular nerve. Big idea, fibular on the front, tibial on the back. Okay, so Fanchan's talking about finding the fibular by the knee. Yeah, finding it up a little bit higher before, or find the tibial. I like the fibular by the knee. Yeah, so up by the fibula, exactly. Yep. So common fibular up here, tibial best seen along the back side of the leg. Yeah, exactly. I want you to make sure as you're working on learning these nerves that we know their locations, because what we're asking you to do with the activities that follow, let me see if I included pictures. Yeah, is we're asking you to predict the actions of nerves based on their locations. So remember, we talked about how the axillary nerve went out into the shoulder. Based on the fact that the axillary nerve goes out to the shoulder, we can predict and accurately predict the axillary nerve is controlling the deltoid muscle. Or that ulnar nerve that we talked about, that we found on the ulna side of the arm, the ulnar nerve helps us to contract flexor carpi ulnaris. The location of that nerve tells me the kind of muscles that it controls. We can go down into the leg. We do this with a couple in the leg. So the obturator nerve is right next to the group of muscles that we learned called the adductor muscles. The obturator nerve controls the adductors, or the femoral nerve that's right along the femur. The femoral nerve helps us out with rectus femoris. So the location of a nerve tells us what muscles it controls. If you don't want to make predictions, if you want to just memorize, you can for the most part. But I believe that on the exam, we are going to ask you about one that you haven't memorized yet. So make sure we know the general location of the nerves so that you can predict which muscles live in that location that it might help control. So our spinal nerves help us control muscles. They also collect sensory information at the same time. So we're back to that axillary nerve that we talked about, for example. The axillary nerve is going to collect sensory information from the shoulder, from the axillary region. The radial nerve, collecting information from the radial side of the forearm. Again, we're back to the obturator and the femoral nerves. The obturator nerve collects information from your inner thigh, and the femoral nerve collects information from your upper thigh. So the locations of these nerves tell us where they get sensory or where they send motor information. Either you can memorize the descriptions in the packet, or if you use the images in the guided lesson, that might be a better use of your time, because we only have so much memorized space, right? We're going to talk about in class tomorrow in lecture about just how much memorized space we have. Or we're going to talk about memory, put it that way. Any questions about this stuff before we move on? Or just send me an emoji. We haven't had an emoji. I'm needing some emojis to brighten my day. I'm going to send somebody looking pretty cool. I love it. Tammy Teo always sends me dolphins. I know where your very good vacation would be, Tammy Teo. Oh, nice. I'm seeing some new ones. Got a lizard, got a dinosaur. Nice. Fanchin wants to make a wish that she could just have all of this downloaded into her brain, right? Oh, well, there you go, Tammy Teo. Dolphin is very appropriate. Okay. So here's what you have. I'm not going to take time now to do this activity with you, but you have in your packet to help you match up with the nerves. So use the locations of these nerves to help you know which muscles they control or which parts of the body they might collect sensory information from. So you have this activity in your packet. You have more details in the guided lesson about that. I want to briefly mention the reflex arc model for us. We have actually already looked at this model when we were labeling the different kinds of neurons, right? So we know that we've got sensory neurons, motor neurons, interneurons. We've already done a lot of the labeling that we see on here. This model technically, though, doesn't just show us the types of neurons in the body. It actually shows us how reflexes work. So coming up in lecture, we are going to talk about some of your basic reflexes in the body, like how when you touch a hot stove, you move your hand away really fast, or how when you step on a Lego, you quickly try not to die from stepping on a Lego, right? Those are reflexes. Happens automatically, takes care of you, keeps you safe. The only things for us to add to the labeling we've done before are the fact that our sensory neurons, and here, help me out in the chat, is it the orange, yellow, or green neuron that is a sensory neuron, Orange, yellow, or green, who's sensory? We'll get that labeled. Yeah, exactly. My yellow neurons are my sensory neurons. My sensory neurons technically have places in your body. So down here, where they actually collect that sensory information, and we call that the receptors. So the receptors are here at the very end. The receptors are essentially the dendrites of our sensory neuron. So we collect sensory information at the receptors. That information travels through our sensory nerve. Hey, look at this. Our sensory nerve's cell body lives inside that bump on the back side of a spinal nerve. What was the name of this bump, or the abbreviation of this bump? My bump back here. Yeah, exactly. This is my dorsal root ganglion. That's where the cell body of my sensory neuron lives. It brings the information into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, where it's going to meet with my interneuron. So my green neuron that I see in here is my interneuron. My interneuron. Yeah, several of us are making a great connection. This one back here is a unipolar neuron. It absolutely is a unipolar neuron. How do we know that it's unipolar, by the way? What does unipolar actually mean? Yeah, exactly. It's got one, right? One branch. So I've got the cell body, and it's got one extension coming off of it, unipolar. So that means that this neuron, its receptors collect information. That information goes straight through those dendrites, straight past the cell body, straight into its axon, and it goes away. This is a unipolar neuron that we see back here. The sensory neuron, which is unipolar, doesn't do any thinking. It just gives that information right away. The interneuron. Remember that interneurons are processing neurons. So my processing neuron figures out how we should respond. Then it's going to send those directions to my motor neuron. My motor neuron is this one right here. Hey, my motor neuron and my interneuron, they are not unipolar. These definitely have more than one extension coming off. What word would I use for these two? They definitely have more than. Yeah, exactly. These ones are going to be multipolar. Multipolar. So I'll put some arrows here. Oh, that didn't work. So both both my interneuron and my motor neuron are multipolar, more than one thing coming off. My motor neuron sends the directions out the ventral root all the way out to, in this case, my muscle tissue. My muscle tissue is what's going to get the job done. So this is what we call the effector, the thing that's going to have an effect, the thing that gets the job done. My muscle tissue that I see out here. I'm reading the question. So we'll talk more about area and association areas tomorrow, Elapina. In general, yes, sensory neurons are going to be taking information to those primary areas in your brain. And then the interneurons are going to help us. We have a ton of interneurons in the brain that are kind of doing the processing. With a reflex, like the one we're seeing in our picture here, reflexes actually don't involve the brain at all. So all the processing that we need to do to make this get activated to have an effect actually just comes from the neuron that lives in the spinal cord. That interneuron takes care of everything for us. All right, so on this model, you have to label the things that we label, except for our multipolar and unipolar. But here's my challenge for you. To help you know whether or not you really know your spinal cord stuff, I would recommend trying to label all of those spinal cord things on this picture too. So see if you can remember their names, the different horns, the roots. See if you can remember the names, our fun word, right, for the white matter. This is a model that we don't make you label all of those structures on, but you've done it so many times with the other spinal cord models. If you can recognize it on here, you are golden. You're all set on knowing your spinal cord stuff. So find yourself, here, let's erase it. Find yourself the ventral root. Find the lateral gray horn. If you can find those things on this model, or you can generally predict where they would be, you know what you're looking for, and you should be in good shape. Yeah, so Kaylin mentioned the one thing that's not on this model is those rami. We don't technically see the branches on this one. We just see a spinal nerve. If we were more anatomically accurate, we would also have another ramus here, for example. So ramus is the one thing. We can't label ventral and dorsal rami because we don't technically have them, but we should have everything else. All right, we've got just about 10 minutes left. I want to open the floor for you to tell me how we want to spend the rest of our time. We already talked about vertebrae. That's a good thing. Okay, so Temiteo, I don't have my lab sheets printed. Would you mind telling me what in particular that's referring to? Is that muscle actions? Is that... Okay, got it. Yeah, so if I'm remembering correctly, that question asks why the knee-jerk reflex is so fast. Is that correct? Perfect. Okay, so we will talk about this one in lecture. The knee-jerk reflex is the fastest one in the body. The reason that one is the fastest in the body is because the moment the doctor taps on your knee, specifically it's the tendon in your knee, our sensory neuron detects the stretching and brings that information into the spinal cord. Rather than talking to an interneuron, the sensory neuron talks directly to the motor neuron in the muscles of your leg and tells them to contract right away. So the reason that the knee-jerk reflex is so fast is because we do zero processing. You're kicking before we even think about any of it. There is no interneuron in the patellar reflex or in the knee-jerk reflex. I saw a note. Oh yeah, I should have. I had a picture that showed us that. Yeah, so here's just to reiterate for us. We've got our sensory neuron that collects that information. That sensory information comes in. Instead of talking to somebody here in the dorsal horns, we just go straight to the motor neuron and we get stuff done. It's kind of like when your kids really want something and they know that if they come to you, it's not going to happen. But if they go to the spouse directly, or worse, if they go to grandma, right? So the patellar reflex, we just skip our processing and we just make it happen right away. So just sensory and motor neuron, no interneuron in that one. I know that somebody mentioned a muscle, at least, will pull up soleus. Absolutely correct. When you're thinking about soleus, think of it as kind of a next door neighbor to gastrocnemius. Gastrocnemius is the muscle on the back of the leg. This is the one, ladies, that looks good in heels, is the gastrocnemius. So the soleus is the one that we see right there next to it. Again, gastrocnemius and then soleus right next door to it. Here on the outside, on top of the fibula, is what we call fibularis longus, because it's right on top of the fibula there. Notice, by the way, you've got this review list of new stuff, or excuse me, of old stuff. And I guess we weren't talking like this week, were we? So this is some of those muscles that we're reviewing. We are to the point in the semester where we absolutely want to start trying to be able to label everything on Muscle Man. So as much as you can, try to remember where all those muscles are. And after this week, we've covered the location of all of the muscles in the body. So that muscle review assignment in Blackboard, you should be good to go on that one. We should be reviewing that. I know he's not our favorite. I don't know if you all noticed it, but in today's class picture, Muscle Man was super huge. I made him bigger than real life. So okay, so I see some questions in the chat about the plexuses. I'll have to do some digging. I don't know for sure what it's key to. Here would be my study tip for finding those plexuses in visible body. Remember that when you're in visible body in the practice assignment, there is an option for you to do, I think it's called like an anatomy search, or there's like a magnifying glass that you can click on, and you could type in lumbar plexus, or you could type in sacral plexus, and see what visible body pulls up as being that. It will highlight for you those structures. So consider doing that to see what it thinks the right answer is, to help you know when you're in the actual assignment what you're trying to dissect to. But for those of you that had the question about that, if you want to send me a follow-up email, I'm not going to have time after class today to stick around and pull it up with you, but I will pull it up this evening, and I'll see if I can get you some more clarity. So send me an email to remind me with your question, and I will make sure to email anyone back who's interested in that. Yeah, so Fanjan, I see you're mentioning having trouble with soleus and visible body. My recommendation would be to dissect off gastrocnemius. Soleus would be underneath there. So I would suggest trying it from that direction. Instead of just trying to find it on the side, maybe go ahead and take off gastrocnemius, and maybe that'll help you to not accidentally hit fibularis. That would be my recommendation there. Okay, one quick reminder, and then I'm going to have to scoot because I'm sharing my office again. Please don't forget about these activities. The very last thing that you have in your lab packet is the last week that we're asking you to predict actions. Please don't forget about doing this, because remember, I think I told you this, and I'll tell you again, I'm going to give you some pictures on the final exam that are just like these pictures you're drawing with this activity. So when you go through and color code things like we've been doing together, I will give you something that shows you the origin, the insertion, and the location of the muscle. And I'm going to tell you that you need to predict the action of it. May or may not be one of these muscles we've drawn before, but I can guarantee for you that I'm not going to tell you the name of the muscle that you're making the prediction on. So we're trying these activities. We're going through and labeling to help us remember where bone markings are, but also to help us remember things like flexion and extension, to help us remember things like abduction and adduction. You can act things out. Now is a great time to practice that when we're doing something like latissimus dorsi, but it's also always a great time to practice on your homework and on that exam. Forget about these activities. This is the very last thing in this packet. Please make sure to work on that once you remember where all of your bone markings are. Go through and label them, color code them, and then make some action predictions. Any last minute questions before I shut off our recording? I feel you, Kaylin, asking for some help. It's like what we started with at the beginning of class, right? Back at you. All right, well, I'm going to end the recording. Remember that tomorrow we are covering the brain lecture, so try to work your way through that lecture. Friday is going to be an exam number 3 review session. So remember exam number 3 coming up next week. We will start reviewing for that on Friday, but tomorrow we'll cover the brain first. So have a great afternoon. Hope to see you all tomorrow.